their print disability, which makes reading, holding a book, or turning a page difficult or impossible. The content is copyrighted by the respective publishers. For more information, please visit us on the web at nfradioreading.org.
Hello, this is Dan, and for the next hour, I'll be reading from the Saturday, Sunday, May 16th through 17th, 2026 edition of the Wall Street Journal, the weekend edition, on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Starting off with the above the fold front cover, Trump, Xi, hail reset after summit. Choreographed visit masks differences as both sides seek stabilized relations. Beijing. President Trump's state visit to China ended Friday with both sides hailing a reset in relations. But each side signaled a starkly different idea of what that means. Trump sought to open China's market to U.S. business and reciprocal trade, reviving a policy he scrapped in his first presidency, though the U.S. president left Beijing without offering any concrete details of any trade agreements. Chinese leader Xi Jinping, meanwhile, wanted strategic stability, a predictable relationship in which Washington doesn't impede Beijing's economic and geopolitical rise. Trump said long-standing U.S. policy on Taiwan, ambiguity over independence for the democratic self-governed island, remains the same. Nothing's changed. I will say this. I'm not looking to have somebody go independent, Trump said in an interview with Fox News. I want China to cool down, Trump said, saying he isn't looking for the U.S. to travel 9,500 miles to fight a war. The shared desire for stable relations is a change after years of mutual antagonism. Strategic stability from strategic rivalry is a major shift, said Henry Wang, founder and president of the Beijing-based Center for China and Globalization. We are moving into a new normal. This summit was an inflection point after a tough relationship that began with the start of Trump. Under the surface, however, there remains an intense rivalry that holds the potential to disrupt the world stage despite the bonhomie of the two-day visit. China is boldly pressing its claims on Taiwan, and its military is becoming increasingly aggressive in the Western Pacific, rattling U.S. allies and posing a serious military and geopolitical challenge to Washington. And China's support of Iran, an issue Trump raised during his visit, could undermine U.S. efforts to force the regime to give up its nuclear program and halt its aggression in the Middle East. Such disagreements didn't cool Trump's show of admiration for a man he repeatedly called his friend. Trump marveled at his reception, from a grand welcome ceremony to a day two stroll through the Chinese leadership compound in Beijing. Throughout the visit, Xi sought to present China as a global power that is quickly closing the gap with the U.S., despite what it sees as efforts by multiple U.S. administrations to contain its rise. Trump, a Republican, said he was, quote, very impressed. The relationship is a very strong one, the president said Friday in the leadership compound in the heart of Beijing. On trade, Trump said on Air Force One that U.S. farmers would be happy with China's purchases of U.S. soybeans. Trump said he and Xi discussed lifting sanctions on Chinese companies that buy Iranian oil. His one detailed announcement during the visit that China would buy 200 Boeing aircraft, fewer than the expected 500, led the company stock to fall 3.8%. The broad takeaway in Beijing was that Trump and Xi both sought an end to a 10-year era in which the U.S. sought to blunt economic and security threats from China. Trump, for instance, in a Fox News interview in Beijing, played down concerns about China's espionage and theft of U.S. intellectual property, and floated the idea of the U.S. allowing more Chinese students, where his administration once threatened to expel them. Xi wants more predictability out of Trump, in particular on trade. U.S. tariffs have hit a key pillar of its growth when some in China were already questioning Xi's handling of the economy. But for Xi, Taiwan is the most important issue, and one that would ultimately make or break the relationship with the U.S. Xi said Thursday that any mishandling of tensions over the island, a self-governing democracy Beijing wants to control, could spark an extremely dangerous situation, a nod in the potential for a great power war. On the flight back to the U.S., Trump said Xi does not want to see a fight for independence because that would be a very strong confrontation. But the president played down the risk of such a conflict. He said he wouldn't tell Xi whether the U.S. would defend Taiwan, later adding, The last thing we need right now is a war. China wants concessions from the U.S. on Taiwan, including small but crucial rhetorical shifts such as moving from not supporting Taiwanese independence to publicly opposing it, while also limiting weapon sales to the democratic self-controlled island. Xi also hailed ties with the U.S., in effect arguing that China's rise didn't pose a threat to the U.S. Achieving the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation and making America great again can go hand in hand, Xi said at a state dinner for Trump on Thursday. The turnaround was months in the making. Last year, U.S. imposed tariffs on China, some rising higher than 100%, prompting Beijing to restrict exports of rare earth materials. Trump and Xi in October brokered a trade détente in South Korea that slashed the tariffs. But after China restricted the exports of the rare earths that are crucial for some U.S. manufacturing, many in Beijing have opposed a shift in how Trump approaches the relationship. China couldn't punch back a decade ago, but now if the U.S. plays hardball, China can play hardball too, Wang said. In recent months, Trump told aides not to derail plans for the Xi summit and labeled the U.S.-China partnership as the G2, suggesting that the superpowers effectively dominate the world stage. China, reading the signs, saw the summit as a chance to assert itself. They are trying to lock in a truce, albeit one favorable to them, said Rushi Doshi, who worked on China in former President Joe Biden's National Security Council. Referring to China, they wanted to lock it in beyond Trump, or use the Trump détente as the baseline for the future. It will take more than momentary camaraderie for Washington and Beijing to change course. Trump, despite his friendly tone toward China, still leads an administration that is tough on Beijing. In recent weeks, the U.S. placed sanctions on Chinese entities suspected of aiding Iran's targeting of U.S. bases in the Middle East and accused Beijing of stealing artificial intelligence technology from U.S. companies. The Justice Department continues to charge people, including U.S. politicians, who are alleged to have illegally aided China. And the war in Iran and U.S. commitments to Taiwan could derail any intended progress, having already clouded a summit centered on economic trade. Trump came to Beijing looking for China to pressure Iran, which largely relies on China for its economic survival, to give in to U.S. demands and agree to an end to the conflict. During the summit, Trump suggested he and Xi saw eye to eye on Iran, noting Beijing agreed that ship traffic through the Strait of Hormuz should be free, and Tehran should never get a nuclear weapon. But China's foreign ministry issued a mid-summit statement with a blunt message that the war should never have been started in the first place. Both men are scheduled for another summit on September 24th in the White House, and might also speak to one another on the sidelines of two international gatherings this year. Continuing with China, Capital Account by Greg Ip, Xi's Industrial Policy of Everything. In the decades since China joined the world economy, U.S. presidents have traveled to Beijing with a predictable list of demands. Stop stealing intellectual property, don't force technology transfer, open your markets. Donald Trump followed the script on his visit in 2017. To repeat those demands this past week would have been pointless. Those demands reflect a view of Chinese industrial policy, broadly government supported and for favored sectors, that is woefully out of date. Xi Jinping has elevated Chinese industrial policy into something the world has never seen. It targets almost every industry and region, demand and supply, services and goods, the sophisticated and the mundane. Its goals are economic, technological, and strategic. Its tools are micro and macroeconomic. There's no obvious solution. Trump reportedly secured agreements by China to purchase soybeans, energy, and aircraft, withhold military equipment from Iran, and open up more to U.S. business. But none of this will stop China from swallowing ever more global market share. Rhodium Group, a research organization, and a sobering new report prepared on behalf of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce identifies the key features of what it called China's industrial policy of everything. Many Chinese products now match or beat Western competitors on quality and price without government help. Yet rather than dial up back support, Beijing keeps broadening it. The country's 5-year plan issued in 2021 listed 19 priority sectors. The latest, released in March, lists 24, adding brain-computer interfaces and nuclear fusion energy. While sexy products such as smartphones and electric vehicles hog this limelight, China's ambitions also cover the mature and the mundane. The Made in China 2025 plan, released in 2015, which caused so much consternation in the West, earmarked 10 industries for self-sufficiency. The 2023 update dropped 1 and added 7, including mature industries such as household appliances and textiles. Chemicals are a good example. Global exports of tetrachloroethylene used in dry cleaning have risen 25-fold since 2019. Exports of O-oxylene used in plastics and coatings have climbed 12-fold. Chemicals also illustrate the emptiness of China's promises to cut back on overcapacity, which has depressed prices and profits. Rhodium reports that a 2025 directive promised to address petrochemical overcapacity, but only plants more than 20 years old were targeted, accounting for 5 to 6% of capacity. Far from shrinking output, the plan aimed to shift the industry from bulk to high-value chemicals and boost outputs 5% a year. Rhodium reports that once Chinese firms reach technological parity with their competitors, they take market share at breathtaking speed. In 2016, Rhodium estimates China controlled more than 50% of export volumes in 163 industries out of about 2,000 for which data are available. By 2024, that had risen to 315. China's massive trade surpluses are often attributed to weak domestic demand. Yet China can create demand when it wants. To nurture its drone industry, Beijing encouraged numerous sectors to integrate drones, complemented by public investment in enabling infrastructure, including the use of local government special bonds, Rhodium writes. Xi once regarded services as inferior to the real economy. Not anymore. State directives single out high-value services such as biopharma contracting. It saw sales double between 2018 and 2022, and they are projected to double again by 2027, Rhodium concludes. National security is integral to Xi's industrial policy. Eliminating imports makes China less vulnerable to foreign pressure, while increasing export market share makes others more vulnerable to Chinese pressure. Thus, Xi prioritizes choke point products that are critical to larger supply chains, such as organic chemicals and machinery, Rhodium reports. China routinely retaliates against unfriendly governments by weaponizing its market. That is, shutting out their exports. Weaponizing choke points is more potent, with potential to shut entire production lines. Even the U.S. saw a trade war truce when China put export controls on rare earths and critical minerals. As dependence on China increases, the capacity of foreign governments to mitigate that dependence diminishes, Rhodium warns. The pervasive nature of China's industrial policy makes it hard for competitors to counter. Trump's tariffs, for example, have driven down the U.S. trade deficit with China, but China has redirected exports to other markets. And because Chinese inputs are omnipresent in global supply chains, the value of Chinese content entering the U.S. can remain steady even as imports drop. This could be addressed through tariffs on Chinese content, regardless of where the product originated, or through tighter rules of origin, a particular thrust of Trump's trade negotiators. But that wouldn't solve the competitive threat. The U.S. could ban every Chinese-made product, but those products would keep gaining market share abroad, threatening U.S. leadership. For example, Chinese electric vehicles may incorporate Chinese software and artificial intelligence. As those EVs gain market share abroad, Chinese software and AI may supplant U.S. rivals as the global standard. This calls for a joint response by all market-based democracies to Chinese industrial policy. But U.S. allies' willingness to coordinate with the U.S. on China has eroded under Trump. The Achilles heel of Chinese industrial policy is its cost and waste. China runs bigger budget deficits relative to its economic output than the U.S. Outside advanced manufacturing, the economy is moribund, weighed down by debt, deflation, and aging demographics. Many critics thus expect, even hope, that Chinese industrial policy will eventually implode under the weight of its own contradictions. But there's no guarantee of that soon. To paraphrase an adage about markets, China can stay irrational longer than foreign competitors can stay solvent. You are listening to our reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Industrial output recovers. U.S. industrial production rose in April, according to data from the Federal Reserve. Production rose by 0.7% last month, after decreasing by an upwardly revised 0.3% in March. Analysts expected a 0.2% increase. Manufacturing activity rose by 0.6%, and output from utilities increased by 1.9%. Mining output ticked down by 0.1%. Industrial capacity utilization was 76.1% in April. New York factory activity expands. Factory activity in New York State grew in May at its fastest pace in over 4 years, according to the latest monthly edition of the Empire State Manufacturing Survey. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York said Friday that its statewide manufacturing index of business conditions grew strongly in May to 19.6 from 11 in April. A consensus of economists had expected a reading of 7. New orders and shipments rose strongly, and employment continued to increase, the survey said. Meanwhile, both price indexes in the survey picked up to their highest levels since 2022, while delivery times and supply availability worsened. Barr cautions on plan to slim balance sheet. Federal Reserve Governor Michael Barr said shrinking the balance sheet is the wrong objective for the central bank, and many of the proposals to meet that objective would threaten financial stability. At an event in Manhattan, Barr delivered the comments after Kevin Warsh's confirmation as Fed chair. Warsh has argued for shrinking the Fed's balance sheet to reduce its large presence in financial markets. Barr said some of the proposals to shrink the balance sheet would actually increase the Fed's role in markets. Many of the proposals to meet this objective would undermine bank resilience, impede money market functioning, and ultimately threaten financial stability, a published text of his remarks said. Barr said an ample reserve regime, the system that set in place after 2008-09 financial crisis, there should be limited money market volatility in normal conditions. If the Fed were to return to a scarce reserves regime, it wouldn't reduce its footprint in the market, given the degree of regulation and intervention that would be needed, Barr said. Without enough reserves in the financial system, Barr said the payment system could suffer because it would give banks reason to economize on their liquidity by slowing down outgoing payments, leading to bottlenecks and other stresses in funding markets. All of these articles were by Jessica Kawacki. Turning to the U.S. for a minute, the Colorado River is on the brink of disaster, by Carl Churchill and Josh Ulick. The Colorado River is running dangerously low, and the 7 western states that rely on it can't agree on how to share what's left. A deal deadline came and went on February, leading the federal government to threaten its own solution, one that would keep the dams generating power, but likely bring painful cuts to water use. We're positive about one thing. No one will be satisfied, Interior Secretary Doug Burgum said last month. The river provides water for 40 million people and more than 5 million acres of farmland. Its dams produce electricity for millions of people. The current crisis is rooted in a compact Western states made in 1922. Officials overestimated how much water the river would provide. By the 21st century, as drought gripped the region, it became harder to meet the deal's water allocation obligations. The diminished water supply, coupled with the growing population, has led to years of shortfalls. To make up for the shortfall, states pull water from the reservoirs, which serve as storage banks for the system. Drawing down reserves has taken a toll. Lake Mead and Powell, the biggest reservoirs in the basin, have fallen about 75% from peak volumes. The water shortages have inflamed tensions between the upper basin states, Colorado, Utah, Wyoming, and New Mexico, and the lower basin states of Arizona, California, and Nevada. The 1922 agreement granted roughly equal allotments from the river, but the lower basin routinely uses more. The upper and lower basins are jockeying to shape a new long-term solution, as several water-sharing pacts expire this year. The unusually warm winter this past year led to this being the worst year for snowpack in Colorado and Utah on record. According to monitoring agencies, officials estimate Lake Powell will receive the least amount of water this year since the reservoir began to fill in 1963. So really just no good news, said hydrologist Cody Moser of Colorado Basin River Forecast Center. Arizona has already cut water usage by nearly a third, and more reductions loom. For now, authorities are sending water from an upstream reservoir to replenish Lake Powell, but it is a short-term fix. There's not enough water to fill the hole, said Brian Richter, president of Sustainable Waters, a global waters education organization. On the front cover, below the fold, yields hit one-year high in global bond sell-off by Sam Goldfarb and Vicky Guiwang. A weeks-long rout in global government bonds intensified Friday, sending the yield on the benchmark 10-year U.S. Treasury note to its highest level in more than a year, and halting a stock rally that had just carried the S&P 500 and NASDAQ composite to new records. Bonds have been hurt for months by the rise in energy prices sparked by the U.S.-Iran conflict. But they came under particular pressure Friday because of a confluence of disparate development worldwide, dragging down major indexes from Tokyo to New York, with the S&P 500 dropping 1.2% from Thursday's all-time high. The main headwind remains Iran. As the weeks go by without a deal, investors have become increasingly pessimistic that the U.S. and Iran will reach an agreement soon that would reopen the Strait of Hormuz and bring down energy prices. Investors had held out hope that President Trump's visit to China would yield some progress on that front, but were left disappointed by the result of the trip. Meanwhile, particularly sharp sell-offs in Japanese and UK government bonds spilled over into the U.S. and other markets Friday. In Japan, price declines were powered by hot inflation data and signs that the government will borrow and spend more to blunt the impact of a higher energy cost. In the UK, investors reacted to the growing threat of a leadership challenge to Prime Minister Keir Starmer, which raised fresh questions about the country's economic and fiscal trajectory. While concerns about domestic inflation have been growing, today's move in yields in the U.S., I think, are a direct result of what's happening in non-U.S. yields, said Leah Traub, a fixed income portfolio manager at Lord Abbett. Yields on treasuries, which rise when bond prices fall, are heavily influenced by investors' expectations for what short-term interest rates set by the Federal Reserve will average over the life of a bond. As the Iran conflict has dragged on, investors have started betting that the energy prices will stay high for longer than originally presumed, pushing the Fed to consider raising interest rates. That is a shift from before the war, when investors expected the Fed to cut the rates this year. When yields rise sharply overseas, U.S. yields typically also rise to reflect the fact that investors can now buy higher-yielding bonds elsewhere. Yields surged across the world on Friday. The yield on the 10-year U.S. Treasury note, a benchmark for borrowing costs across the economy, settled at 4.59%, its highest closing level since February 2025. The yield on the 30-year U.S. Treasury bond rose around 0.12 percentage point to 5.127%, its highest closing level since 2007. The Japanese 30-year yield jumped around 0.16 percentage point, while the UK 30-year yield surged 0.19 percentage point. Oil prices also rose in response to the lack of progress toward Hormuz deal, with U.S. crude front-month futures gaining 4.2% to 105.42 a barrel. Stocks fell broadly, with the energy sector the lone bright spot. The S&P 500 dropped 1.2%, but still eked out a 0.1% weekly gain. The Dow Jones Industrial Average slipped 1.1% or 537 points, while the NASDAQ gave up 1.5%. Rising Treasury yields can sometimes drag on stocks by increasing the cost of borrowing for businesses and consumers and making bonds more appealing as an alternative investment. But so far, stocks have withstood that pressure, just as they have shrugged off the increase in energy prices. Indexes have repeatedly touched new highs in recent weeks, propelled in large part by a blistering rally in semiconductor shares. While the sector's hot streak hasn't been without volatility, individual investors have aggressively bought the dip, using any brief pullback to accumulate shares. Some investors attributed Friday's stock declines to simple profit-taking after a powerful run, rather than a direct response to the surge in yields. People are just taking chips off the table, de-risking a little bit after a long, very strong run, said Brad Conger, Chief Investment Officer at Hurdle & Co. In other words, I wouldn't take it as a signal that anybody's given up on their positions. There was much less confidence about the bond market. John Briggs, head of the U.S. rate strategy at Natixis Corporate in investment banking, said he wouldn't be surprised if yields rise another tenth of a percentage point, given a lack of obvious catalysts on the horizon that could spur a reversal. It doesn't seem like we're getting a lot of solutions for any of the stuff that's taking us here, he said. Looking at the UK for a moment in world news, leadership quagmire in the United Kingdom deepens. Markets are spooked as political angst is likely to fester throughout the summer by Chelsea Dulaney and Max Colchester, London. After a week of mounting political drama, the stage is set in the UK for months of uncertainty over who will lead the world's fifth biggest economy, as unpopular Prime Minister Keir Starmer embarks on a long and messy fight for his job against the left-wing mayor of Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham. Burnham said late Thursday he planned to stand for election to Parliament, opening the path for him to take on Starmer for the leadership of the ruling Labour Party. It would mark the first time a sitting Labour Prime Minister has been challenged while in office. The prospect of Burnham, a darling of the Labour left, who once said the UK needed to get beyond this thing of being in hock to the bond market, entering Downing Street, has alarmed investors who are now pricing in higher government spending if Starmer is booted from office. UK government borrowing costs climbed Friday to their highest level since the 2008-09 global financial crisis, piling pressure onto an already fragile government finance system. The pound and stocks also came under pressure. The arrival of Burnham, who has said he backs nationalization of utilities and wealth and a wealth tax, and who has questioned rules constraining government spending, raises the prospect of British politics again roiling markets. Among investors, that triggers bad memories of when former Conservative Prime Minister Liz Truss sparked a market meltdown with a series of unfunded tax cuts in 2022, before being quickly shunted from office. The risk is that a new, further left Prime Minister pursues policies that further add to business costs, eroding profit margins, and putting upward pressure on inflation, says Andrew Weisart, an economist at Berenberg, a bank. Starmer won in 2024, vowing to bring a period of stability to help boost the economy after an unprecedented run of turnover in the top job, with Starmer becoming the fifth prime minister in 7 years. But the political uncertainty of a months-long leadership race now will throw more sand into the wheels of an economy struggling to grow and facing higher energy and food costs due to the Iran war. UK debt markets have been hit harder than other development economies, a reflection of the economy's outsized economic vulnerability to the war. Other factors like the Bank of England's effort to shrink its portfolio by selling bonds and the retreat of some traditional buyers like pension funds have also fueled volatility, analysts say. UK borrowing costs have shot up almost a full percentage point since the Iran war began, nearly double the rise seen in German bonds, and a 0.6 percentage point rise in U.S. Treasury yields. Starmer and his Treasury chief, Rachel Reeves, spent the past 2 years trying to win back global bond investors after the Truss fiasco by sticking to strict, self-imposed budget rules, which investors worry will come under threat. Starmer is on the ropes after Labour was crushed at recent local elections and his personal approvings rating sank to 20%. Pollster Ipsos asked Britons who should lead Labour if Starmer resigns, and 17% chose Burnham, more than triple his nearest rival, former Deputy Prime Minister Angela Rayner. Other possible candidates include Wes Streeting, who resigned as Health Secretary this past week to pressure Starmer to stand down. Burnham has complained that Britain's fiscal rules, which forced the government to try to reduce debt as a percentage of gross domestic product within 5 years, act as a straitjacket. In past speeches, the 56-year-old has set out a vision for a more active state, including the mass construction of public housing. Recently, he has suggested that borrowing for military spending should be counted outside the government's fiscal rules. Analysts say the room for fiscal maneuver in the UK is tight. The government's debt stands at 94% of GDP, which, while lower than several European peers, has shot up at a much faster rate as the state absorbed the twin shocks of the 2008 financial crisis and COVID-19. This year, the UK government is expected to spend over 8% of its budget simply paying off the equivalent of about $150 billion in interest charges on the debt, nearly double its defense budget. The recent climb in borrowing costs will add to interest costs. If debt levels in the UK are already close to 100%, it means that the government needs to continue to borrow, said Mamit Kumar, a chief European economist at Jefferies in London. So as rates go higher, the interest rate expense of the government is also higher, and that almost becomes a spiral. The UK doesn't benefit from the kind of built-in demand for its currency and debt that the US enjoys, with the dollar's reserve status attracting huge investment from abroad. Burnham may try to convince markets that he will ensure his plans add up. They are aware that there is a sensitivity in the UK bond market given the state of public finances, said Peter Groves, head of developed market debt sovereign research at MFS Investment Management. So it could be the case that Burnham comes out and says, I'm a sensible guy fiscally, I'm not going to do anything unfunded. To replace Starmer, Burnham must first win a special market sometime this summer in Makersfield, a northern English district in Greater Manchester, to become a lawmaker. While the district has traditionally been a safe Labour seat, he will have to contend with the rise of the anti-immigration Reform UK party, which is leading national polls. If he wins, he then needs the support of 20% of Labour lawmakers to trigger a leadership challenge. Starmer could at that point quit, but he could also try to duke it out with Burnham. The Labour Party's 300,000 members, as well as union members, would choose a winner. The process could drag on for months. You are listening to our reading of articles and features on the Wall Street Journal from the weekend, You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Turning for a minute to just look at World Watch. Ukraine attacks death toll in Kiev reaches 24. The death toll from a Russian missile attack that flattened a Kiev apartment building rose Friday to 24, including 3 teenagers. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said as he led the mourning for one of the deadliest attacks on the capital in the 4-year-old war. The missile hit the 9-story corner apartment block Thursday during what the Ukrainian Air Force said was Russia's biggest barrage on the country of the full-scale invasion. Emergency workers finished digging through the rubble, searching for victims after more than a day. Crowds of grieving people, Zelensky and other top government officials visited the site to pay tribute to the dead, as did Kiev-based foreign diplomats. Russia has hammered Ukraine with large-scale aerial attacks in the days since a May 9th through 11th ceasefire that U.S. President Trump said he asked Zelensky and Russian President Vladimir Putin to observe. Fighting continued over those 72 hours, although reportedly on a lesser scale. In the Congo, at least 65 dead in Ebola outbreak. Africa's top public health body Friday confirmed a new Ebola outbreak in Congo's remote Ituri province, with 246 suspected cases and 65 deaths recorded so far. The deaths and suspected cases have been recorded mainly in the Mangolo and Rwampara health zones, the Africa Centers for Disease Control and Prevention said. The Ebola virus is highly contagious and can be contracted through bodily fluids such as vomit, blood, or semen. The disease it causes is rare, but severe and often fatal. The agency said preliminary laboratory results had detected the Ebola virus in 13 of 20 samples. The results suggest a non-Ebola Zaire strain of the virus, with sequencing ongoing to further characterize the strain, the agency said. The Ebola Zaire strain has been prominent in Congo's past outbreaks. The latest outbreak comes around 5 months after Congo's last Ebola outbreak was declared over after 43 deaths. Peru. Presidential runoff finalists are set. Peruvian voters will choose their next president between a political dynasty heiress and a former trade minister who has promised to reform Peru's mining sector after the two advanced Friday to Peru's June presidential runoff election. Keiko Fujimori, the conservative daughter of a disgraced former president, and Roberto Sanchez, a nationalist congressman, will face off to become Peru's 9th president in just 10 years. Both beat 33 other candidates with promises to put an end to surging crime, the priority for Peruvians whose country's mining-driven economy has proven resilient to political instability. With 100% of the ballots counted from the April 12th election, Fujimori of Fuerza Popular led the field with 17.18% of the vote. According to the final results published Friday by the National Office of the Electoral Processes, Sanchez of Juntos por el Perú finished second with 12.03%, securing his place in the June 7th runoff. DHS boss shifts course after Nome exit. Mark Wayne Mullen is trying to improve agency's image ahead of the midterm elections. Washington. Homeland Security Mark Wayne Mullen has embarked on a wholesale effort to clean house at his embattled department, firing officials closely associated with his predecessor's leadership and reviewing her spending decisions, according to people familiar with the matter. Mullen's moves follow the ouster of former Secretary Kristi Noem, who attracted unflattering attention for her department's aggressive immigration enforcement, culminating in the killing of two U.S. citizens, protesters in Minneapolis, as well as her spending millions on flashy government-run ad campaign prominently featuring herself. The secretary, who has no prior immigration-related experience, faces the challenging task of improving the department's image ahead of the midterm elections while still implementing President Trump's central campaign promise of mass deportations. Mullen has told associates that ahead of November, his primary marching orders are to lower his agency's profile and avoid bad press, so the issue of immigration recedes in the public consciousness, according to people familiar with the matter. Polls show voter approval of Trump's handling of the immigration to have declined, and the president has told advisors that some of the previous team's moves went too far. So far, Mullen has directed U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, not to launch any large or overly aggressive immigration raids, such as those Noem directed in Los Angeles, Chicago, and Minneapolis. People familiar with his directive said many officials inside the department and the White House have been gratified by his lower key approach, after they have come to believe the dramatic raids turned public opinion against Trump's immigration goals and put ICE officers at unnecessary risk. He has taken a more hands-off approach than Noem, telling his sub-agency heads they have the expertise to run their own organizations, according to people familiar with the matter. Noem had sought to funnel decision-making through her office, including a requirement that she had to sign off on any spending decisions over $100,000. Mullen scrapped that rule. Though many of the administration's outside allies have remained supportive of Mullen, some have said he hasn't put enough attention on Trump's promise to carry out mass deportations. The number of daily ICE arrests has fallen by several hundred since last winter. At the peak of the operation in Minneapolis, people familiar with the internal data said, "What matters are the numbers, and the numbers are still low," said Mike Howell, president of the Oversight Project, who leads the Mass Deportation Coalition, a group pressuring the administration to do more. A DHS spokeswoman said ICE wasn't slowing down. White House spokeswoman Abigail Jackson said the president's highest priority has always been the deportation of illegal alien criminals who endanger American communities. Mullen is doing a great job continuing to deliver on that objective, she said. Mullen has spent his first few weeks quietly reversing many of Noem's policies and personnel decisions. He has removed officials closely allied with Noem and top advisor Corey Lewandowski across the department, including the chief of staff at ICE and the deputy director at U.S. Customs and Border Protection, according to people familiar with the moves. On Thursday, Mike Banks, the Border Patrol chief who was Noem's ally, resigned from his post. The DHS spokeswoman said personnel changes were part of any transition. He has encouraged staff to review previously signed contracts and cooperate with the agency's inspector general, which has launched several probes into the agency, administration officials said. The inspector general's office had grown frustrated by a lack of cooperation from Noem's team, the inspector general wrote in letters to Congress. The secretary has brought back employees who had been placed on administrative leave by Noem and Lewandowski, along with dozens of Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, staffers whose contracts had abruptly been ended by the agency, according to people familiar with the matter. Under Mullen, Cameron Hamilton, former FEMA chief who was fired in polygraph by Noem and Lewandowski, has been renominated for the role by Trump. Hamilton has already been advising the secretary, according to people familiar with the matter, as Mullen tries to balance calls from some in the administration to drastically overhaul the agency with ensuring robust and timely disaster response. In one instance, Mullen removes some restrictions on a classified Inspector General report showing that one of Noem's policy moves, allowing airline passengers to pass airport security without removing their shoes, created new security vulnerabilities in the system, according to a person familiar with the matter. Noem had ordered the report received a high level of classification and placed restrictions on it so it couldn't be broadly viewed. A close ally of Trump, Mullen hasn't relied as much on Stephen Miller, the president's deputy chief of staff, to run the department, according to people familiar with the matter. While the two men have had a professional relationship, Mullen has been given more leeway at the agency, the people said. A White House official said Miller and Mullen speak regularly, and the DHS spokeswoman said the secretary keeps in touch with Trump, Miller, and the border czar Tom Homan. And in the inset box here, reversing course on several initiatives. Markwayne Mullin has put high-profile initiatives on pause, including a plan to build out immigration detention capacity with commercial warehouses. DHS spent more than $1 billion on warehouse purchases, but the department will likely ultimately move ahead with developing only some of the 11 properties into working detention centers, people familiar with the matter said. DHS is also expected to allow the closure of Florida's controversial Alligator Alcatraz, one of the state-run facilities that Kristi Noem had relied on to increase detention capacity. This summer, ICE plans to revert to a 12-week training schedule for new officer recruits, scrapping an accelerated training course adopted to fast-track the hiring of 10,000 new officers. The rush training came under criticism from Democrats and former law enforcement officials who said it would result in putting undertrained officers on the street. And redirecting for a moment to look at some U.S. Watch news. New York, LIRR rail workers poised for a strike. Rail workers for the Long Island Railroad were poised to go on strike at 12:01 a.m. Saturday morning as labor unions and the Metropolitan Transportation Authority, or MTA, remain split over the size of a wage increase. Hundreds of thousands of commuters from the New York City suburbs would face disruptions, especially if the strike extends to the work week. The MTA has planned contingency shuttle buses, but is already warning that they will be insufficient. The operator has asked commuters to avoid non-essential travel and to work from home if a strike occurs. Both sides say they remain at the bargaining table. The LIRR is the busiest commuters railroad in the country, ferrying about 300,000 commuters each weekday on 947 daily trains. If this strike occurs, it would be the first LIRR strike since 1994. The two parties were scheduled to resume talks on Friday at 11 a.m. Also in New York, mistrial declared in Weinstein trial. A New York judge declared a mistrial Friday in the criminal trial of Harvey Weinstein, marking the second time a jury has deadlocked on whether the disgraced Hollywood producer raped an aspiring actress in a Manhattan hotel room. A separate jury last year also deadlocked on whether Weinstein raped the woman, Jessica Mann, in 2013. Prosecutors have 30 days to decide whether to retry the case. The trial revolved around the testimony of Mann, a then aspiring actress who alleged that Weinstein raped her at a DoubleTree hotel in March of 2013. Prosecutors argued that Weinstein wielded professional influence over Mann, who made efforts to stay on his good side even after the alleged incident. Weinstein's legal team pointed to Mann's consensual sexual activity with Weinstein and to years of friendly messages between the producer and actress. And there's a picture of some horses on a track ride around. Horses worked out Friday at Laurel Park in Maryland ahead of the 102nd running of the Black-Eyed Susan race. The track is hosting the Preakness Stakes for the first time on Saturday while Pimlico Racecourse undergoes reconstruction. You are listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition on the Niagara Frontier Radio Rating Service. Turning now to opinion. How America Can Put Teeth in Its Blockade by Eugene Kontorovich. Mr. Kontorovich is a professor at George Mason University Scalia Law School and a senior legal fellow at the Advancing American Freedoms Mises Institute for the Rule of Law. Rival blockades have deadlocked the U.S. confrontation with Iran. The U.S. can gain some leverage in the stalemate by reviving the law of prize, which governs ships seized during war, and by authorizing privateers to attack enemy shipping. Both measures would tighten the blockade while showing Tehran that the U.S. is playing for keeps. The U.S. has intercepted or diverted at least 3 Iran-linked ships in the past month. In late April, the U.S. seized the Iranian-flagged MV Tuska after firing on the cargo ship when it tried to break the blockade. Declaring a captured vessel a prize of war already provided for in the U.S. Code would allow the government to take ownership and sell the oil, with proceeds going to the Treasury. For hundreds of years, international law has allowed belligerent powers to seize civilian enemy vessels, and even ships of neutral third parties, if they engaged in prohibited activities such as carrying contraband or breaking a blockade. Under prize law, the vessels and cargo become the property of the captor and would be auctioned for profit. This practice stood in contrast to the prohibition against plundering civilian property on land because of the recognition of the integral relationship between maritime commerce and war. U.S. vessels took prizes starting in the Revolutionary War. Dealing with prizes was one of the few powers given to Congress under the Articles of Confederation. Prize law provided rules to govern the practice and to protect against abuse. Before the captor could take title to a vessel, he would have to bring the ship into port and have it condemned before a prize court, which would determine the lawfulness of the capture. Prize cases long ago filled the U.S. courts, with the Supreme Court ruling in a prize appeal during the Civil War that the practice didn't require a declared war, only an actual one. The federal statutes authorizing prize jurisdiction for district courts remained on the books. Prize law's vitality as part of international law was reaffirmed in 2012 when Israel seized the Estelle, a Finnish-flagged ship that was part of a flotilla seeking to break the blockade of Gaza. A Haifa court held that international law still authorized prize taking, but Israel had waited too long to bring the condemnation proceeding. The taking of prizes fell globally in the 20th century, largely due to the changing nature of shipping and naval warfare, including the decline in the use of blockades. A battered mid-sized cargo ship may not be worth the trouble of bringing to port for adjudication, but that isn't the case with tankers loaded with Iranian crude. In 2023, in a rare enforcement procedure, the U.S. Justice Department seized the Suez Rajan, a tanker carrying almost 1 million barrels of Iranian oil, for violating U.S. sanctions. The cargo was sold in Galveston, Texas for $83.4 million. Given America's naval supremacy over Iran established in the war, a ship could be brought to port in the U.S. without significant risk of recapture. U.S. prize law allows for establishing prize courts in the ports of co-belligerents. Seized vessels could be brought to Dubai or Eilat, Israel, further cementing regional alliances. Prize taking has practical advantages. It would allow for condemnations of vessels not on any sanctions list, as well as neutral vessels trying to break the blockade. It would also show that the U.S. is serious about its belligerent rights as a blockader, which can extend to sinking blockade runners anywhere in their journey. Even a ship that got through the Navy's gauntlet in the Gulf would know it isn't safe. Reviving the prize law could be complemented by Congress's issuing letters of marque and reprisal. These are licenses for private parties, known as privateers, to capture prizes at sea. Letters of marque are endorsed in the Constitution, though the U.S. hasn't used them in 200 years. An 1856 treaty purported to ban privateering, but the U.S. refused to sign. The private security forces that some shippers engage today to prevent piracy could do the work of privateers. Boarding slow-moving tankers is relatively straightforward and can be done from a fast boat or helicopter. Authorization of privateering would allow the capture of Iranian vessels now being turned back or disabled. It would also signal an intent to maintain the blockade. Letters of marque regulate against abuses. Privateers are paid only if they honor all the restrictions on their activities. Licensing privateers would demonstrate the primacy of the Constitution over international law norms that America rejects. Recent articles in the Naval Institute's proceedings argue that letters of marque would be essential in alleviating the vast numerical asymmetry between the U.S. and Chinese fleets in the event of a war. The conflict with Iran could be a useful test of these legal tools. Rex Reed and the Legacy of American Openness, Declarations by Peggy Noonan. I want to mention America's wide openness. I don't mean our traditional openness to foreign-born citizens, which is its own triumph, but our wide openness to ourselves. It is unique to us, a tradition and a thing of lore. The thought is prompted by the death this week of the movie critic Rex Reed, aged 87, who was the object of an affectionate appreciation by his friend Marin Corrado, who was Reed's editor at Observer. Mr. Corrado tells of a Southern boy who knew no one, had no connections in the professions to which he was drawn, entertainment and journalism, and rose to the top. Reed was born in 1938 and adopted by a family in Fort Worth, Texas, and was an only child whose family moved around a lot. He attended more than a dozen schools and found permanence not in places or friendships, but in the movies, which he loved from childhood. He went to Louisiana State University, studied journalism, and interviewed anyone who came to South to make a movie. When Paul Newman, Lee Remick, and Orson Welles came to Baton Rouge to film The Long Hot Summer in 1957, it was big local news, and Rex showed up to cover it for the school paper. His friend Elizabeth Ann Cole begged to tag along. She caught the acting bug so severely that she dropped out, moved to New York, and changed her name to Elizabeth Ashley and landed on the cover of Life within a year. Reed moved to New York, took a job in movie publicity, and was laid off. The firing liberated him. He began freelancing show business profiles. Ms. Corrado quotes Reed, "I took the lowest form of journalism, the celebrity interview, and did something with it. For a boy with no money who didn't know a famous soul to come to New York and make a name in journalism, that was no small achievement." He wanted to live in the famous Dakota and bought an apartment there before he had furniture. His first night, the doorbell rang. It was the celebrated film actor Robert Ryan, head of the Co-op Building Board, welcoming him. Talk about dreams come true. Reed went on to write, act, and become a quirky and incisive film critic. He was operating at the top of the celebrity world as America was becoming celebrity nation. But the important part is he knew nobody, had no connections, no family ties, no history, and the whole system was wide open to him. It's very open here. It still is. You can zoom up to the top, and the top will accept you and say, "Hello, what you got?" It's an attitude of spaciousness built into a system of economic freedom, and we don't want to lose it. You can think within 2 seconds of stories of nobodies who became somebodies. In business, you can go from before Andrew Carnegie to after Steve Jobs. Beyond business, you'll think Lincoln in the dirt floor log cabin becomes president. Oprah Winfrey of rural Mississippi hardship invents a media empire. You could think of Yip Harbsburg of Manhattan's Lower East Side, whose father worked in a sweatshop and who went on to write Over the Rainbow and Brother, Can You Spare a Dime, and became a reigning Broadway presence. Jay-Z from public housing in Brooklyn became a cultural powerhouse and a wealthy man. The wide openness of the system in which they rose has always distinguished America, and it's part of our mythos, our ethos, and our style. And it's no accident. All this is so obvious it feels embarrassing to talk about. But I continue to think about the political challenges to our traditional ideas of economic freedom that will be coming the next few years. We will be grappling with the fundamental questions: how to approach the idea that a lot of capitalism has developed, or devolved, I should say, into some kind of financialism in which people who are good with numbers move them around and get rich. How to solve the problem of a tech universe that produces wild and awesome wealth, the concentration of which seems weird, unnatural. And what about artificial intelligence? All that is going to be decided by voters in the next decade or so. But the answer isn't socialism, the old idea that is rising again. Free market capitalism is a vast imperfect mess of a system, but it was created and involved with wisdom. In America, new wealth and success wouldn't be tolerated by establishments so much as taken as proof that America got the economic end of things right. There would be no unseen ceilings, no sense you don't go beyond your station, as there was in old Europe. And things were set up so you could rise quickly. You can go from Irish peasant to American working class family, then to division manager, Wall Street titan, Broadway producer. Because it could happen so quickly, it was witnessed. When you witness something, you believe in it. Clarence Thomas and Sonia Sotomayor came from little in material sense, he from tiny Pinpoint, Georgia, she from a Bronx tenement, and later a housing project. They are now in the Supreme Court. Did that little boy and that little girl understand who they'd be in history? Well, they'd probably seen others rise. They'd been witnesses too. This faith that you can change and improve your circumstances, it has a powerful effect on a country's temperament. Is it unbelievably corny and retro to say free market capitalism was built for the little guy? Let's be corny and retro. In Europe, the bankers backed people they knew socially, those with a name. In hungry America, investors would back people with no name but a brilliant idea. That could be anybody. It could be young, deaf Thomas Edison. Private property, the rule of law, in the American system, common people could make binding agreements, own property, open businesses. You didn't have to be fancy to own something. Bankruptcy laws help by making failure survivable. You fail and try again without being destroyed. None of it is perfect. It was never perfect. Other systems have geniuses too, but America, like no other country before it, offered its geniuses a stage and a chance to star in the show. State socialism has always been constructed, heavy, static. It has trouble creating anything. It isn't fizzy and alive. What it does is allocate. But allocators always and inevitably favor their own interests and networks. In the Soviet Union, the governing class, those who held the party posts, there's always someone in power. In every system, tended to be mediocre and hackish at best, utterly corrupt at worst. Their system didn't work and couldn't grow, and the geniuses were denied a stage. American free market capitalism generates. It allows things to be brought to life. Socialism merely distributes what it is. And in the end, it always relies on lies, the first of which is always that of it works. Our way of doing things is unpredictable, chaotic, and can break your heart. People compete. Competition can be painful. People lose. But our system was invented to grow and throw off wealth and energy and make room for you. That's what we have to make sure it continues. It's fantastic wide openness. And When Ice Came for My Daughter by Jen Rickling, my daughter-in-law. It's been a month and I'm still processing what happened to my son Matthew and my daughter-in-law Annie. You may remember reading about their story. In early April, our family was filled with joy for Matthew and Annie's late March wedding. Matthew, who was 23, joined the U.S. Army in 2021 as a staff sergeant. My husband and I accompanied the newlyweds to Matthew's post in Louisiana. We planned to help them start their life together and help my son prepare for training and deployment. Instead, when we arrived at Matthew's base, Annie, 22, was detained by Immigration's Customs Enforcement agents and taken away in handcuffs. After nearly a week in detention and public outcry, she was freed. Yet even now, Annie and Matthew's future together is uncertain. Annie can't travel outside Louisiana and has to wear an ankle monitor for how long isn't clear. Annie is everything you would hope for in a daughter-in-law. She's a Sunday school teacher and a biochemistry major, nearly finished with her college degree. She's also a dreamer who was brought to this country from Honduras when she was 20 months old. When Matthew and Annie found each other, I saw something that every mother wants for her child. That is why I didn't hesitate in giving Matthew his grandmother's wedding ring last Christmas when he told me he wanted to ask Annie to marry him. In southern Arizona, where I live, immigration and border security are always in the news. Yet it wasn't until Annie and Matthew's marriage that those issues directly affected our lives. I saw how complicated and contradictory they could be. No, I don't believe every person who crosses the border illegally or overstays a visa should be allowed to remain in this country. But I do believe that there has to be a better way for Annie and other dreamers. Annie has had a deportation order that was issued when she was a toddler. That was in 2005 when her parents didn't show up for an immigration court hearing in Houston. Since that time, she has studied hard, demonstrated her character, and fallen in love with a man serving his country. As a teenager, she applied to the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals program, paid her fee, and was fingerprinted for a background check. Her application, made in 2020, is still pending, stalled by sporadic freezes on new DACA requests. Annie has had no path to obtain a green card or otherwise become illegal. Even now, despite her marriage to Matthew, the prospects aren't certain. A deportation order from when she was a baby shouldn't override the life she has built. I am a proud conservative who supports President Trump's efforts to secure the border. I also agree with his pledge to find a way for dreamers to stay in this nation, and his comments following his re-election. We have to do something about the dreamers because these are people that have been brought here at a very young age. Some of them no longer young people, and in many cases they become successful. They have great jobs, and we're going to have to do something with them. I asked Mr. Trump to ensure that his administration is following through on his wishes for dreamers like Annie. There aren't any bad guys in this story, only people trying to navigate an immigration system that is at odds with common sense and American values. Annie told me that the ICE agents who arrested her and took her to the detention facility were incredibly kind. The Army couldn't have been more supportive of Matthew. Annie's attorneys and all those who spoke out on her behalf went above and beyond in their dedication to her case. While the immigration system is complicated, the questions I am wrestling with are not. Is it better for the nation if Annie and other dreamers with pristine records are targets for detention? Or should they have a way to become fully participating Americans, especially after marrying a U.S. citizen? Annie isn't the first military spouse to be detained. I don't know the details of each case, but I do know that we are a nation at war asking enormous sacrifices of our service members. The government should clear a high bar before targeting their families. Matthew gives everything he has to his country. Watching him grow into a man who wears the uniform with honor and integrity has been one of the greatest blessings of my life. I am proud of Annie and the courage, grace, and love she has demonstrated during this terrifying chapter of her life. I believe in this country, I believe in our president, and I believe we can do better than this. Mrs. Rickling is a wife and mother in Arizona. You've been listening to a reading of articles and features from the Wall Street Journal Weekend Edition, Saturday, Sunday, May 16th through 17th, 2026. We read from the Wall Street Journal Weekend edition every Monday at 7 p.m. Your reader has been Dan. Thank you for listening.
You're listening to the Niagara Frontier Radio Reading Service. Volunteer radio readers broadcast daily readings, 24 hours a day of newspapers, magazines, books, and other printed matter to area. The following program is intended for listeners who are blind, have low vision, or have another print disability, which